Understanding how sentences are structured can make a huge difference. In this video, we'll break down the SVO rule. SVO stands for subject, verb, and object. We will take a look at the SVO rule. We will then apply it to legal writing and see how you can use it when drafting letters and emails and things like that. And also we will take a look at the active and the passive voice as well. Feel free to use the timestamps in the description of this video if you would like to jump ahead to any particular sections. Okay, let's get started. So first of all, what is the SVO rule? The SVO rule is the most common sentence structure in English. It ensures that the subject, verb, and object appear in a clear, logical order, making the meaning of sentences easy to understand. For example, in the sentence, "The lawyer writes the contract," the lawyer is the subject, writes is the verb, and the contract is the object. This structure helps us to understand who is doing what in a sentence, and it is critical in legal writing to follow such an obvious structure. So here we have examples then of the subject, the verb, and the object, and the definition of each one. So the subject of any sentence is the person or the thing that is doing the action. The verb is the action being performed, and the object is the person or thing receiving the action. So subject, verb, and object. When looking at the subject-verb-object rule in legal writing, in legal documents, this structure is essential for ensuring clarity and precision. In other words, you want what you are writing to be very easy to follow and easy to understand. So clarity, the subject-verb-object structure avoids any confusion about who is responsible for an action, and precision, so precise words will help to reduce the chances of legal disputes, and this is something we will look at in future videos on this channel, how legalese, legal terminology, if you do not use specific words and specific vocabulary, it can lead to legal problems as well as comprehension problems. An example of this then would be in the sentence here. So in the sentence, "The client signs the agreement," it's immediately clear that the client is responsible for signing, and the agreement is the document being signed. However, by changing the word order, if we were to say, "the agreement the client signs," it would be more ambiguous or unclear, because essentially the agreement the client signs could be any agreement, whereas in the first sentence, "the client signs the agreement," it is much clearer exactly what the context of the situation is. So looking at subject, verb, and object in contract then. So we will take a real world or a real life example for this one. So the sentence, "The buyer agrees to pay the seller the purchase price." So this is an example of a sentence that you might see in a contract. The buyer agrees to pay the seller the purchase price. So this sentence clearly shows who is agreeing, that is the buyer, what they are agreeing to, they are agreeing to pay, and to whom they will pay the purchase price. The subject-verb-object structure in this sentence makes the terms of the agreement very easy to understand for everybody involved. And here is a breakdown again of exactly the subject, the verb, and the object in this sentence. So, as with any rule in grammar, in the English language, there are exceptions. So although the SVO structure is the foundation of clear English sentences, legal English often includes variations. One common exception is the use of the passive voice, which shifts the focus from the subject to the object. Now, the passive voice is something that many of my students have struggled with over the years. It is often seen as a more complicated or complex way of communicating, and it is. But particularly in legal English, as you become more advanced and you want to sound more articulate, it's very important to use the passive voice and to know how to use it. So the passive voice, so the object is placed before the subject, which emphasizes the action. So an example of a passive sentence would be, the contract was signed by the client. In this case, the contract is the focus. It is the essential element of the sentence. And the action, which is being signed, is emphasized more than the client who performed it. So when we use a passive sentence, the contract was signed by the client, what's really important there is that the contract was signed. By the client is not so important. In fact, you could just say the contract was signed and leave it there, and it would be totally fine. In legal writing, the passive voice is often used when the action or result is more important than who performed the action. So another example of this would be a guilty verdict was handed down, or a guilty verdict was passed. So it's not important that a judge passed the verdict or which specific judge. All that matters is that a verdict was passed. Looking at the active and passive voice together then, so the active voice is usually preferred because it is more direct and clearer. It's much easier to understand. However, there are instances where the passive voice is appropriate. So the active voice focuses on the subject performing the action. An example of this would be, the defendant paid the fine. The passive voice then, the focus is on the action or the object rather than the subject. So for example, the fine was paid by the defendant. So this version shifts the focus away from the defendant and onto the fine. In legal contexts, you would use the active voice when you want to emphasize the subject and use the passive voice when the action or outcome is more important than who performed it. Let's take a look now at some common writing mistakes that we often see in legal English. So when writing legal documents, mistakes in word order or incomplete sentences can lead to ambiguity, which means it can lead to the meaning not being clear, which is dangerous in a legal context. And some common mistakes would be things such as incorrect word order. So if you rearrange or you change the order of the words, the meaning becomes unclear. And in some cases, the meaning can change altogether. Another example would be a missing object. So sometimes people forget to include the object, making the sentence incomplete. And these mistakes can lead to confusion, so always check that your sentences follow the correct subject-verb-object structure. So, when should you not use the subject-verb-object rule in legal writing? Well, there are instances or situations when the SVO structure is not necessary. Usually when you are trying to be very brief or you are writing in a very formal tone. Legal notices and formal phrases will often omit or leave out parts of the SVO structure. For example, in terms of brevity, So being brief and precise, in legal documents you might see phrases like contract terminated instead of the contract is terminated. The meaning is not lost by making the sentence more concise, so contract terminated is fine. In terms of short forms then, so legal notices often omit the subject and verb to save space, such as payment due on March 1st. This is a very, very common example. Rather than saying the payment is due on the 1st of March, there is no need to say that. You can simply say payment due on March 1st. So in situations like this, it is not necessary to follow the strict rule. These omissions are acceptable because the context makes the meaning very clear without the need for the full structure. Okay, so now that we have covered the subject-verb-object rule, when to use it, when not to use it, and the exceptions, it's time now to put it into practice. So here are 3 sentences that I would like you to practice with. So the first one, the lawyer prepares the will. Second one, the contract was drafted by the lawyer. The third one, payment to be made by the client. So looking at these 3 sentences, I want you to ask yourself, can you identify any exceptions or any rules at play here? What is the structure of each of these sentences, and if they do not follow the subject-verb-object rule, why? If you think you know why, please feel free to write your answer in the comment section below. And if you would like to see more in terms of legal English or legal grammar or just English grammar in general, be sure to check out the other videos on our channel.